The only hard surfaces we see is these thin lines, which are the corridors and angular structures we have on the object.
There is a particular kind of silence that settles over a research vessel when the sonar operator stops talking. Not the silence of boredom, but the silence of someone who has just seen a shape on the screen that doesn't belong there. That silence is what Dennis Åsberg has been describing, in one form or another, for more than 14 years. He was not looking for history-altering discoveries in June of 2011. He was looking for old bottles of cognac and forgotten cargo, the ordinary spoils of a treasure hunter's trade. What his sonar fish dragged back instead was an image that would follow him for the rest of his career, and one he is still trying to explain to a world that mostly stopped listening years ago. This is the story of the Baltic Sea Anomaly, told as honestly as the public record allows, what Asberg and his team actually found, what independent scientists who examined the same evidence actually concluded, and the wide, uncomfortable gap that still sits between those two accounts. To understand why a blurry sonar return became an international sensation, you have to understand the water it came from. The Baltic Sea is unlike almost anywhere else on Earth. Its salinity is so low, and its temperature so cold, that the shipworm responsible for devouring wooden hulls in the Atlantic and Pacific simply cannot survive there. The result is a seabed that behaves like an underwater museum. Centuries-old wrecks rest on the silt with their masts still standing and their decks still intact, looking less like archaeological sites and more like ships that quietly slipped beneath the surface yesterday. That reputation is exactly what drew Peter Lindbergh and Dennis Åsberg, the founders of the salvage and exploration outfit that became known as Ocean X Team, into those waters in the first place. They were professional wreck hunters, not geologists, and their business depended on finding intact, sellable history under the mud. On a routine pass during a 9-day expedition in the Gulf of Bothnia, tired and close to heading home, their sonar fish recorded something that didn't look like a shipwreck, a reef, or anything in their experience. It looked like a roughly circular object, about 60 meters across, sitting on the seafloor at a depth of around 90 meters, trailed by a long, flattened track that ran for several hundred meters across the bottom. Lindbergh would later describe the object in radio interviews as having unusual stair-like formations, and he openly speculated, almost playfully, that if it really was constructed by hand, it would have to predate the last ice age by a wide margin. He even floated the word Atlantis, fully aware of how that word would travel. What actually exists, and what is sometimes implied to exist, are two different things, and that gap is where most of the public confusion took root. The hard evidence Ocean X Team produced is a single sonar image, indistinct, low resolution, and open to interpretation. The crisper illustrations of a stepped, fortress-like structure that circulated in tabloids and later in countless online videos were artistic renderings, not direct sonar captures. Several scientists who reviewed the original data publicly questioned whether the equipment used was even capable of resolving fine architectural detail like staircases or square chambers at that resolution and depth. That distinction matters enormously, because it is the difference between we photographed a staircase and we photographed a blurry shape and then described what we thought it might look like. Asberg and Lindbergh have always maintained the second framing is unfair to what they witnessed in person and on later, higher-resolution scans. But it is the first framing that took hold in the public imagination, and it has proven nearly impossible to walk back. The most consequential part of this story, and the part that gets the least attention in the more sensational retellings, is what happened when actual rock samples left the ocean and reached an actual laboratory. Diverse chipped fragments from the formation and delivered them to Volker Bruchert, an associate professor of geology at Stockholm University. His findings were unambiguous: the material was granite, gneiss, and sandstone, exactly the kind of rock you would expect to find scattered across a basin that had been scraped and reshaped by advancing and retreating glaciers tens of thousands of years ago. There was no evidence of artificial manufacture, no anomalous alloy, and no material inconsistent with the region's well-documented geological history. Bruchert later found himself in an uncomfortable position when Swedish tabloids quoted him in ways that made it sound like he was endorsing the mystery rather than explaining it away. When journalists circled back to verify the more dramatic claims attributed to him, he clarified that he had not been consulted about several of the conclusions being attached to his name, and that the straightforward geological reading of his own lab results had been quietly dropped from many retellings of the story. It is a useful reminder that even when real scientists are involved in a story like this, their actual words can be cropped, recombined, or simply invented around once the story leaves their hands. Bruchert was far from the only expert to look at the available evidence and reach a mundane conclusion. Jarmo Korteniemi, a Finnish planetary geomorphologist who has spent his career studying impact craters and glacial landforms, pointed out that the Fennoscandian shield beneath the Baltic is an old, thick, geologically quiet craton with no volcanic activity for hundreds of millions of years, which rules out several of the more exotic explanations floated online. He suggested the formation was most consistent with a drumlin, a teardrop-shaped mound of sediment and rock smeared into place by the underside of a moving glacier, a landform found by the thousands across formerly glaciated regions of Scandinavia, Canada, and the northern United States. None of this proves the team fabricated anything. People can be sincerely convinced of something extraordinary and also have a financial interest in others believing it too. Those two things are not mutually exclusive, and they happen constantly in the worlds of treasure hunting, paranormal television, and amateur archaeology. But it is a relevant piece of context that any honest telling of this story has to include, because it helps explain why the most dramatic version of events kept getting amplified while the more boring geological explanation struggled to get the same airtime. A pattern that repeats itself. It is also worth noticing how familiar this entire arc is, because the Baltic Sea Anomaly did not invent a new genre of mystery storytelling, it simply gave that genre a fresh location. A small, blurry piece of raw data gets collected by people without specialized training in the relevant science. A dramatic interpretation gets offered, almost as a question, in an early interview. That interpretation gets repeated, sharpened, and stripped of its hedging words each time it passes through another article, another forum post, or another video essay, until it might look like stairs quietly becomes divers found the staircase. By the time the story reaches a wide audience, the tentative original observation and the confident retelling have become almost unrecognizable from one another, even though no new evidence was actually collected in between. This is not unique to Asberg or to the Baltic. The same pattern shows up around unexplained sounds in the deep ocean, unusual radar returns, and oddly shaped rock formations photographed by planetary rovers. The shape itself is rarely the problem. Humans are extremely good at recognizing patterns, sometimes too good, a tendency researchers call pareidolia, the same mental reflex that finds a face in a power outlet or a rabbit in a cloud. What turns an ambiguous shape into a viral mystery is usually the gap between how confidently a claim is stated and how thoroughly it has actually been tested. The Baltic Sea Anomaly sits squarely in that gap, and has sat there for over a decade now, because closing it would require exactly the kind of unglamorous, well-funded, independently verified expedition that nobody with the right combination of money and motivation has yet been willing to fund. Where the story actually stands today. More than a decade on, here is the state of the evidence, stripped of embellishment. Ocean X team produced a single, low-resolution sonar image of an unusually shaped, roughly circular mound on the floor of the Gulf of Bothnia, trailed by a flattened ridge. Independent geological analysis of physical samples taken from the site identified ordinary granite, gneiss, and sandstone, materials entirely consistent with a glacially shaped landform. Multiple geologists and marine geophysicists, working independently of one another, have offered natural explanations, ranging from a drumlin to a moraine field to a cluster of related bathymetric mounds already documented nearby. No peer-reviewed scientific paper has ever concluded that the object is artificial, ancient, or anomalous in a way that defies known geology. The claims of electromagnetic interference remain undocumented by any controlled instrument study and rest entirely on the personal recollections of the people who made the discovery and stood to benefit from its fame. That is not a satisfying ending for anyone hoping this article would confirm a sunken UFO or a 14,000-year-old monument. But it is the honest one, built from named scientists, published analysis, and a documented record rather than from atmosphere and inference. What Dennis Åsberg actually wants people to understand. None of this means Dennis Åsberg is lying, and it would be unfair to flatten his decade of persistence into a cynical sales pitch. By every account, he genuinely experienced something disorienting on that boat in 2011, and he has spent years, and a meaningful amount of his own money, trying to get a more rigorous, better-funded expedition back to the site with modern equipment capable of settling the question once and for all. That is not the behavior of someone simply chasing a quick headline. Chasing headlines is cheaper and easier than chartering research vessels. What seems closer to the truth is something less cinematic but still genuinely human. A man who stood over something strange early in his career, watched the scientific establishment shrug it off without, in his view, ever giving it the deep, well-funded look it deserved, and has spent the years since unable to let that unresolved feeling go. The mystery he is defending may ultimately be ordinary geology dressed up by exhaustion, excitement, and the retelling of a story across 100 interviews. Or there may be a detail the existing samples and single sonar pass genuinely failed to capture. Either way, the only way to actually close the question is the unglamorous one, a fully funded, scientifically supervised expedition, with instruments calibrated and witnessed by independent researchers, willing to publish whatever it finds, mundane or not. Until that happens, the most responsible thing anyone can say about the Baltic Sea Anomaly is also the least dramatic. It is very likely a strange but natural product of the same glaciers that carved the rest of Scandinavia, sitting at the bottom of a sea that happens to be extraordinarily good at preserving whatever lands on its floor, discovered by people who were primed by hope, fatigue, and the lure of a good story to see more in it than the rock itself may ever justify. The seafloor does not need to hide a spaceship or a 10,000-year-old temple to be worth exploring. Sometimes the truth Dennis Åsberg has been trying to tell for 14 years is simply that the ocean is strange enough on its own terms, and that the line between wonder and wishful thinking is thinner, and more human, than any of us like to admit.